In the 1920s, our understanding of the universe was growing due to advances in quantum physics and relativity. During this time, a high school student with an obsession for electrical phenomena discovered a curious new effect. He found that applying a high voltage across a Coolidge tube produced a force, one that could act against gravity. Convinced that he had discovered a connection between electricity and gravitation, he eventually wrote up a paper and built a device called the Gravitator. Thomas Townsend Brown, who would describe gravity as a push and not a pull effect, would later go on to work with the US Navy, take part in the Second World War, get shot and rescued, save lives with his inventions, work with a very secretive private organization, develop an abiding interest in UFOs, and take a serious crack at anti-gravity machines, all under the shroud of secrecy and highly classified projects. Sadly, this also meant that most of his contributions never made it to history and science books. In today's podcast, I speak to Paul Schatzkin, biographer of Thomas Townsend Brown. Paul has painstakingly put together details about the life and work of this obscure genius in his book, The Man Who Mastered Gravity. I hope you enjoy this video, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you. Paul Schatzkin, welcome to Stopping the World. I hope you're having a great day.
I've been having a great day. Of course, we're in entirely different time zones, so I'm at the end of my day while you're just at the beginning of yours, so I can report that I've had a good day.
Thank you for being on the channel. And Paul, of course, is the author of this amazing book that I read called The Man Who Mastered Gravity. It's a biography of this really enigmatic scientist called Thomas Townsend Brown. Now, I have to say, my first brush with Thomas Townsend Brown was at least a couple of decades ago when I read this book called The Philadelphia Experiment. And it was exactly the kind of book that my physics professors would discourage me from taking seriously if I wanted to have a career in science. So I guess that kind of gives you an idea of the circumstances that Thomas Townsend Brown worked under and the kind of work that he did. So Paul, I want to start off by asking you, in your words, who exactly was Thomas Townsend Brown?
Well, it's not something that is easily put in a simple declarative sentence, but I will answer that question the way I have typically answered it when I've had a conversation like I'm having now. And the conversation goes like this. Have you ever heard of the ionic breeze air purifier? Well, that was a device that was advertised on infomercials and in the Sharper Image catalog in like the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. It's an air filter that uses an anomalous electrical effect that Townsend Brown discovered as a teenager in the 1920s. Right. And when I was first introduced to Brown and began to go down the rabbit hole, what I discovered is that there is a league of people around the world who think that anomalous electrical effect, which Townsend Brown discovered in the 1920s, when employed in a different manner than the ionic breeze air purifier and using different materials, produces something along the lines of a synthetic gravity or anti-gravity effect. And so at that point, I went down the rabbit hole of trying to understand who this man was and discovering that he led a very, as you say, enigmatic life where most of the information that would ordinarily be available about an accomplished scientist has been stripped from the records. So to try to answer your question simply, Townsend Brown was, and remains a mystery because the nature of the work that he was doing doesn't lend itself easily to any kind of conventional, orthodox scientific explanation. You asked me who was he? I could talk about. He was born in Zanesville, Ohio. He had a fairly affluent background. His family had the means to fund his scientific experiments. He had a kind of questionable academic career because he was trying to pursue things that his teachers found unorthodox, and so he doesn't have the kind of credentialed history that you would often expect to find with somebody when you're talking about advanced scientific achievements. And he went into the Navy to try to get some support for his work. And in 1942, he left the Navy under very questionable circumstances. And after that, he becomes a complete enigma. And so the existing record of Townsend Brown is very spotty and very suspect. And I would actually commend your teachers who's tried to steer you away from the Philadelphia experiment, because the work that's in the Philadelphia experiment is part of the camouflage that we're beginning to understand surrounds all the work around Townsend Brown. So by putting something in a book like the Philadelphia experiment that is highly questionable to the trained scientific ear, we discredit Brown and then steer attention away from whatever it was he may have been doing.
Right. And of course, you described it as a rabbit hole, and I agree. So how did you get involved, and how did you decide to write a book, a biography no less, of such an enigmatic person? Because obviously details are very hard to come by, and I imagine you spent many years collecting information and sort of gave up and then finally decided to publish the book.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for me to separate this work from the first book that I wrote, because I was preoccupied for a very long time with the story of a man named Philo T. Farnsworth. His work in the 1920s, in roughly the same period that we're talking about with Brown, is the genesis of every video screen on the planet. And even though this is the most influential invention of the entire 20th century, we don't know his name either. So I am drawn to these stories of unknown inventors. And as I was finishing my work on the Philo Farnsworth biography in roughly 2002, I was thinking that this was work that I wanted to do now, and I wondered what my next project would be. And it was during that summer of 2002 that I got an email completely out of the blue from a source that I have still not clearly identified nor met, introducing me to Townsend Brown. And as it says in the book, this email said that Townsend Brown, it mentions the ionic breeze air purifier, and that some of his work has been making millions of dollars for people like the Sharper Image, but he never received a dime. And other work of his can be seen in blue lights floating over the desert of Nevada. So that was my introduction to Townsend Brown. And like I say, it came on the heels of finishing up the work on my first book about the guy who invented video. And because I was looking for an encore project, something to do, that kind of fit into my wheelhouse. And I started reaching out to people that operated a website that had some information about Brown. And I really think to a certain extent that all of this was kind of preordained, predestined. Maybe mystical forces are at work here, because once I began to inquire on this subject, the path began to clear for me. And even though she was kind of hiding or staying out of the public eye in the desert of Southern California, I got a chance to be introduced to Brown's daughter. And we formed a partnership. And then starting in the spring of 2003, I met her in Las Vegas, and we spent a couple of days together going through the family archives. And then this became the project that I undertook. So the simple answer to your question is I got interested in this because it seemed like a logical sequel to the project that I had already finished. And then as it unfolded, it turned out to be not so much a sequel in the same as it's not a similar story, but the two stories at times seem to me to be of a piece, that they kind of belong together and tie into each other somehow.
That's interesting. Also interesting is the fact that your introduction is as enigmatic as the character himself. And I spoke to Nick Cook in my previous podcast, and he sort of mentions that somebody somebody left an article or a paper on his desk, and he doesn't know who, and that sort of started his path down this thing. So it's really enigmatic, like who's doing all this. It's like there's this secret organization overlooking who wants this information come out, or what
I
is your
don't
opinion
think
on
that
that?
you can discount that there are larger forces at work here and something being slowly unveiled. And the experience, I finally had a chance to speak with Nick Cook myself, and I used him as a source. I think that he has done some of the most credible research on Townsend Brown that anybody's done in the last 25 years. And he does get into the Philadelphia experiment, and you can almost see how effective the Philadelphia experiment was, because when he gets close to Brown and he begins to read about the Philadelphia experiment, he begins to discount Brown, and he doesn't go a whole lot further. He does a lot of very credible research about Brown, and I don't want to discount that. But you can almost see how the forces that were trying to be careful about how Brown's story is revealed were at work there. And that Philadelphia experiment book is, I think, very much part of that. But I do think it is curious that Nick Cook and I had kind of consonant experiences, very congruous, very similar, and that this just kind of came over our transom and something about it struck a nerve with us, and we both followed it up.
Right. And you mentioned talking to his daughter, Townsend Brown's daughter, Linda, and your book, of course, it's basically put together, it's pieced together based on the information that you received from multiple sources. Of course, there's Linda, and there's this unnamed character pseudonymous character called Morgan, and there's O'Reilly.
Yeah, Linda was the primary source. And what Linda and I discovered as we were beginning to try to reconstruct her father's life, and remember, Linda spent long periods in her father's absence, so she doesn't know what she was doing. She also spent as much time as anybody in her father's presence, working with him in various laboratories around the country on the stuff that I think he was doing on the surface, and not the important stuff that he was doing behind the scenes. So Linda became the primary source, and early on in the process, we kind of arrived at the conclusion that what we were trying to do was like spilling all the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle out on the table, and then realizing that we had no cover image on the box top to guide us in assembling the picture, the jigsaw puzzle. And it just became an almost intractable process over a period of time. And then after about a year, we began to get messages from the mysterious source that I have codenamed Morgan in the book, who began to provide some of the more behind the scenes information, but in a very guarded way, because whoever the source was, and the source inferred that he was somebody that Linda had gone to high school with and was then drawn into whatever clandestine network Townsend Brown was part of after his high school experience. Whoever that source was not at complete liberty to answer a lot of my questions directly. So I had to try to read between the lines. And where this book differs so greatly from the first book is that the first book was relatively easy to do as an objective third-person biography, a conventional kind of biography. This one became as much about what my experience was trying to get to the story, and then the relationships that I formed with my clandestine covert sources with whom I had extensive email correspondence.
Right, and to this day, you don't know who that was who was sending you that email, right? So, like, who Morgan was actually.
I have at best a couple of ideas of who Morgan was, but I can't say with certainty that I know exactly who he was. And he may be, as Nick Cook infers in his book, he used a lot of, quote, blended characters. And he had a character that he relied on called Daniel, I think it was Daniel Marcus, Dr. Daniel Marcus. Now, Nick told me that he actually met Marcus on several occasions, and I don't doubt that. I never had the opportunity to actually meet these sources that I was corresponding with. So if you want to take everything that the stories that I'm telling with some kind of grain of salt, I think that's entirely reasonable. That's why I have couched the story in the way that I have. This is my experience of trying to research and tell this story, and how much I can state with factual certainty is kind of unknowable at this point, but it still makes for a really interesting story. And we know that Townsend Brown was a real person and a real mystery, a real enigma.
Right. And of course, where the stories of Morgan and Linda also intersect at many points. And I guess Linda was able to provide some points of corroboration as to like the existence of this person called Morgan.
Absolutely. And she had her own personal contact with this individual. And then Morgan introduced me to another individual who in the book is codenamed O'Reilly. And I think the character who was O'Reilly was also a presence in Linda's life. And he had experience with Townsend Brown during the period of his life that is of the most interest, starting with when he left the Navy in 1942. So I was really working with these three sources, one of which was very real and material and tangible to me, and two of which were of less absolute certainty.
Right.
But their stories do kind of corroborate. They run together. There is some consistency to them, I think.
Right. So in a way, in trying to build a picture, like a complete picture of Townsend Brown, like who he was as a person, as a family man, as a father, and that information came from his daughter, and information related to his work and all the classified stuff that he was doing came from these other two mysterious sources.
Yeah, correct.
Right.
And then I did a lot of independent research of my own. And some of that experience is included in the book as well. It became very difficult, even trying to use the typical objective sources, like going to the National Archives. There's a great story in the book about trying to find the FBI files and running all over Washington, D.C., because one source told me it was at this place, and that place told me it was at the first place. And when I got back to the first place, then they told me that the FBI files that I was trying to find had been destroyed years earlier. And that's just so typical of what this experience was like. The expression that Morgan used when he was describing to me how Townsend Brown's life was camouflaged and concealed, the expression that Morgan used was sheep-dipped. And that's a reference to a farming process. When you want to delouse a farm animal, you dip it in some vat of some chemical, and that removes all the vermin, the bacteria or whatever from the sheep. And that's kind of what the story is like with Townsend Brown. His records have been sheep-dipped. And when you go to find the records, you find they're not there.
Right. So they've been sanitized in some way.
They've been sanitized in some way. And that, of course, raises all kinds of questions like, who's doing the sanitizing? And what are they actually trying to cover up? And then we're asking questions that are even harder to answer about how much could actually be going on in some completely secret realm with advanced technologies that the public is kept unaware of.
Right. So Before we dive into some of the details of his work, what is your, having spent so much time looking into this and so much research, having done so much research, what is your speculation or gut feeling? Was there something really secretive and high tech going on that they're trying to cover up, or is it like a decoy to cover up some other black operation or something that's more earthly and mundane?
I have been re-engaged in this for about a year now, or a year and a half or so, because as you mentioned at the start, I worked on this project initially from 2003 to 2009. And then because I couldn't make the kind of sense of material that I was inclined to work toward, I kind of ran screaming out of the room with my hair on fire in 2009. But I never stopped thinking about it. And it took me almost 13 years to reach the point where I could come back to the material and make another run at trying to make sense of it. And so now that the material is out there and I'm engaging in conversations like this, and other things are happening around it, like the hearing that we had in Congress last summer, where the fellow named David Grush tried to tell as much as he could about what he knew from his experience, I'm getting closer to being able to accept the proposition that yes, there is something very real and viable in the work that Townsend Brown did, and that continues to be developed in a realm so dark that, like a black hole, light can't even escape from it.
Right, right. And so do you think I know it's very difficult to answer in plain and simple terms, do you think Townsend Brown mastered gravity, which is sort of the title of your book?
I actually do, yeah. And I come to that conclusion somewhat belatedly because some other conversations I've had have compelled me to take a closer look at Brown's disclosures from the 1920s. That's when he was talking about the gravitators. And that's when he was building devices using what's known as a solid dielectric. Are you familiar with the lifters? Have you seen any of Jean-Louis Nadin's work on the internet? The lifters are based on the same discovery that Brown made in the 1920s, the Biefeld-Brown effect. And in a way, the lifters seem to be part of the subterfuge because they can be proven to not be an anti-gravity effect because they employ what's called a fluid dielectric. So in the lifters, you have the triangle of a band of aluminum foil, which is the positive electrode, and then suspended above that on balsa wood posts are a wire that traces the same outline as the triangle, and that's the negative post. It's the negative chases the positive. So the aluminum foil is the negative and the wire is the positive. And when it's charged, a lifter will instantly lift off the ground, and it looks like it's defying gravity. But it has been pretty well proven that there is an electrical wind happening, that there's an ion exchange between the wire and the aluminum plate at the base. So that's the result of being in a fluid dielectric where ions can be generated. So we discredit the idea that this is an anti-gravity effect, or I prefer to say a synthetic or artificial gravity effect. And I'm not really sure why I've settled on that terminology, but I just like it better than anti-gravity because that brings so many elements of like science fiction and fantasy to it. What we're talking about really is producing an artificial gravitational field that can work against the gravitational field of the Earth. So the lifters provide counter evidence for an artificial gravity effect because they are relying on ionic wind. But what Townsend Brown disclosed in the 1920s was based on a solid dielectric. So what you have is a metal plate and a very high K or high capacitance material on top of that, then another metal plate, then another layer of the high K dielectric, and you stack that up. And that's what the gravitator was disclosed in the 1920s. And even as recently as around 2009 or 2010, somebody who was a contributor to my early Townsend Brown forums built one of those devices. And it weighed 3 pounds. But when he applied a high voltage direct current to it and placed it on a scale, the weight went from 3 pounds to 1 pound. How do you account for that? Weight, what you measure on a scale, is a function of the effect of a gravitational field on the mass of an object. So if something is causing the weight to change, then arguably you have produced a synthetic gravitational field that is working in opposition to the Earth's gravitational field and then producing an element of lift and changing the weight. So that is how I have recently come to the conclusion that, yes, I do believe that Townsend Brown's approach to producing artificial gravity by means of electrical currents is a viable force.
Right. When you mention fluid dielectric in the case of the lifter, you are referring to air, right? Because the air acts as the dielectric in between.
Yeah, air is a fluid, effectively, yeah.
Right. And it's interesting, that this is mentioned in your book, that Townsend Brown himself seemed to sort of sabotage, and like, I think there was this Pearl Harbor incident, and he himself wanted to actually create a doubt about the nature of the phenomena, and he had these demonstrations to people where it was clearly ionic wind, and he seemed to want people to believe that.
That is part of what appears to be the subterfuge of the 1950s. And in the book, it's referred to as Townsend Brown's wounded prairie chicken routine. And that's just a reference to the behavior of a certain animal. When it's being preyed upon, it pretends to be wounded and the predator will no longer pursue it, or pretends to be dead, I guess. So what you're talking about is, I think this is a critical turning point in the clandestine Black story, where after working at Pearl Harbor, at Barber's Point actually, in the late 1940s to early 1950s, there was a point at which he demonstrated, I believe, the solid dielectric device to the Navy, to the military at Pearl Harbor. And the story is that there was a mole. There was a whole chain of espionage agents working within the Allied American English intelligence establishment, most notably a man, the Philby network, Kim Philby, who was providing information out of American and English sources to the Soviet Union. And the story that I tell in the book is that there was an agent for Kim Philby present at Pearl Harbor who witnessed this event and then, I guess, passed it on to Philby and then to the Russians. So the decision was made to try to camouflage the work by, as you say, turning from the solid dielectric to the fluid dielectrics and then demonstrating that. And there are several instances in the story where it was demonstrated, and the people who observed it kind of snickered under their breath. Well, obviously, whoever's doing this has not studied their elementary school or high school physics, because anybody knows this is ionic wind. But what we were demonstrating was not the real thing that Townsend Brown was working on.
Right. And he, of course, at some point visited Paris to do the test in vacuum.
Yeah.
Which is also mentioned in your book, I think, which proves that it is not ionic wind.
That's right. Yeah.
Were the reports conclusive? Because I think it wasn't, like, maybe it wasn't published, or do you know it was like conclusively proven at that point?
Well, I can send you a link to something called it was called the Montgolfier project. Now, the Montgolfier brothers were the Frenchmen who developed the first lighter than air balloons in the 18th century. And so this was a callback to that. The project wherein this aviation company in Paris or France brought Townsend Brown over and built him vacuum chambers so that he could test his devices. They did it under the guise of what's called the Montgolfier project. And there is a report on the Montgolfier project on the web, and I can send you the link to that if you want to see it. I had an opportunity to interview in 2008 a man named Jacques Cornillon, who was actually the man who met Townsend Brown in 1956 and arranged this whole process in France. And I spoke with him just months before he died, I think at age 98. He was living in Pennsylvania at the time. And so he has written these reports, and with the help of his daughter, provided all that material on the internet now. And it's a process that seems very consistent with this whole strange phenomenon of hiding things that we're talking about, where once they began to get some results that at the very least demonstrated clearly in a vacuum that there was some unaccounted for anomalous electrical effect happening in this vacuum, well, then suddenly the company is acquired by another company, and the funding is cut short, and the project is shut down, and the report is inconclusive.
Right.
You see a
Talk
trend
about suspicious.
here?
Yeah. And okay, so this leads me to the question. So if this, now it's been, of course, many, many decades since this information about, the the force generated between two asymmetric electrodes is available on the internet, why haven't, I mean, the world, I would imagine, is full of brilliant physicists and scientists. Why hasn't someone else, privately or secretly or publicly, or some university, taken it up as a challenge and put a solid dielectric and proved that, yes, it is possible to do this in vacuum and it is an anti-gravity effect? Like, why aren't other people doing it?
Well, I agree with you that it needs to be done again. But what I just cited for you was the most recent incident that I know of, where this fellow who had been a contributor to our forums did build a solid dielectric gravitator stack and was able to produce what he attested to was a reduction in the object's weight on a scale. Now, this is not a peer-reviewed report. It is not done under the guise of orthodox scientific study. So I agree with you. It needs to be done again. And if the results prove, it would be good to have a result one way or another from a credible scientific source. And there may be an effort with somebody else that I've been talking to recently to mount just such a challenge. But I think you're right. The time has come to do that.
But do you think the composition of this dielectric itself is critical? Is that like proprietary and secret? Is that why maybe other people may not have this same extent of effect? Like, you need to be very specific about what you put, how you layer, what is the composition, and so on. Is that the thing that is secret?
I think we're getting into advanced applications of what we're talking about. And then to carry to a more logical conclusion, we're wondering how something that can simply demonstrate a reduction in weight could actually be converted into some kind of propulsion device that could lift a whole vessel out of the Earth's atmosphere or even off the ground. And I don't have a good answer for you for that. But I also recently saw a video. It was a talk given by a man named Hal Puthoff. Now, that name may be familiar to you. Hal Puthoff is a guy who's got his fingers in a lot of pies. Yeah. And he is a source for Nick Cook as well. But this video that I recently saw, he just says very quickly, he makes a reference to layers of, I think he says bismuth, but he mentions layers of some very some layers of some substance that are less than the width of a strand of hair. And that got me to wondering if there was a way to engineer a material that had the dielectric built into it into such a way that a surface could have those artificial gravity properties when the surface is charged in a certain way. You know, I've learned enough from the research that I've done to know that the very first iteration of any new technology is going to be crude beyond comprehension. When you go back, for example, and look at the very first drawings that Philo Farnsworth did for what became the network of video that dominates our world today, it's hard to see the connection, but it's clear and it's direct. So add 100 years to what Townsend Brown was doing, and there's no telling there is literally no telling what might be possible. And that's a true statement, whether it's viable or not. There's no telling. And then it raises all kinds of questions about how could something so profound be kept a secret? Who's keeping it a secret and why? And those are the questions that I keep running up against, that I keep bouncing off of, and why I went screaming out of the room with my hair on fire in 2009. It's like, okay, I'm trying to be rational here, but this story just keeps not being rational.
Right. Actually, when you mentioned this material with bismuth, it kind of rings a bell now. I don't remember the source, but many years ago I remember reading that when somebody did this material analysis on some, well, quote-unquote, recovered otherworldly craft, they found that it was layered with a nanometer thickness of bismuth and magnesium composite.
That's an interesting combination. Yep, because there you have the magnesium serving as the electrode and the bismuth serving as the dielectric. And
Right.
that is kind of what Hal Puthoff was describing in that little video snippet. It was in one of Jesse Michaels' American Alchemy videos. I think it was the one he did where he interviewed both Hal Puthoff and is it Hal Weinstein, another scientist of some fringe note. And I think that clip was in the middle of that one.
Right.
Yeah.
Just to temporarily change focus from his
Sure.
work onto his family,
Uh-huh.
because his family plays a very, very critical role from what I read in your book. And his wife, for example, who he completely relied on, who was very supportive and who could keep secrets, like you mentioned in the book, also played a critical role in him being, allowed to just do his research freely, right? Because they were traveling all the time, and what was happening there with his family?
Well, the critical ingredient in that aspect of the story is how much they moved over the course of their lives together. Townsend met Josephine Beale in, I think, 1928. They were married in 1928 and discovered that in Josephine, he had somebody that he could confide his deepest secrets. And I think that they both had the expectation going in that they would follow a kind of a conventional path to the realization of those dreams and the manifestation of their lives together, not realizing that they were going to run up against some forces of opposition or doubt or dispute that threw obstacles in their path. But she did stay with him through periods of tremendous hardship, particularly during that period in the 1950s when he had to appear to the world as some kind of failed scientist and inventor. And so they were living for a while under very, meager means. And it was a very difficult time in their life. Their son, he had a very estranged relationship with their son, who was born in mid 1930s, I think. Joseph. And Joseph thought he was going to be the heir to the Townsend and Brown family fortune, but that fortune got dissipated in the 1930s. A lot of it was actually lost during the Depression. And so he felt like he was the victim of his father's flying saucer pipe dreams. And they had a very estranged relationship. But just the fact that Josephine stayed with him as they moved back and forth across the country. And there are many tales in the book about how when they first got married, Josephine received as a wedding gift this little green ceramic teapot. And they stayed at a lodge on the family property. The lodge was called El Nido. And she named the teapot El Nido. And every time they got ready to move, that was the first thing that she packed. And when they reached their new destination, that was the first thing she unpacked.
Right. Do you think they divorced or separated briefly so Townsend Brown could protect her for something?
I believe that is the case. Now, here is one of the solid things that we were very surprised to find during the course of our on-the-ground research. I had a kind of a research assistant, a historian and genealogist from Zanesville, Ohio, Lace Lynch, who has been instrumental in providing a lot of things that Linda and I were not able to get our hands on. And she discovered in the Zanesville newspapers 2 snippets of information. The first from, I think, 1938. And you'll forgive me for not remembering all the dates as well as I should at this point, but I think it was 1938 that announced the divorce of Townsend and Josephine Brown. And then there are numerous articles where Josephine Brown is part of, Josephine Brown, and I think she started using her maiden name again, Beale, but she is part of the Zanesville social circle as a divorcee. And the suspicion, the best suspicion we can is that Brown was involved in some kind of very clandestine intelligence work, and that for her protection, he separated from her. And then they were remarried in early 1940.
Right.
And
right.
one of the reasons that I tell so much of the Morgan and Linda story is because to me that was a parallel construction that kind of demonstrated in a more contemporary framework what Brown and Josephine's life must have been like, with him operating under the umbrella of some unknowable intelligence or industrial espionage organization, and the strains that that put on their relationship. Because when Linda's boyfriend, that I codenamed Morgan, got drawn into that same network when he demonstrated his capabilities to Townsend Brown, then their relationship became very strained, and they actually had to split. Right. And that was something that Josephine said to Morgan: if you're going that way, if you're going to the root of this intelligence work, then you must let Linda go.
Yeah, right. And Josephine was also, there's this incident that you talk of where she actually inspired him, or rather her hip bones inspired him to come up with the design for a mind-sweeping invention.
Yeah, I'll see if I can do justice to that story. So this is when Brown is working openly for the Navy between 1940 and 42, and the war has started, and the Allies are losing a lot of ships to German mines around harbors and stuff. So they were trying to come up with some kind of minesweeping, anti-mine device. And I'm really not going to be able to do justice to the story off the top of my head. I guess I'll have to reread this one so I can do, if anybody asks me about this one, I can do it better the next time. But I think it may have been during the course of what we're calling their second honeymoon, when they were remarried, and they're at I think a hotel in Washington, D.C., and he's working on this minesweeping technology, and he, as you say, he caressed her hip and had a moment of revelation where it suddenly dawned on him that the way to float the anti-mine devices was by putting the air pockets inside like a sausage and floating them that way. And how he made the connection between Josephine's hip and a mine-destroying device, I don't know. But that is the story, that Josephine's hip inspired an anti-mine device, an anti-seagoing mine device that had an impact on the outcome of World War II.
Right. Speaking of World War II, of course, he was heavily involved there, and there's this really like a spy James Bond movement where he jumps out of a plane and gets shot at and gets saved. And there is, interestingly, you mentioned there is a James Bond connection, because there is Sir Ian Fleming, who was part of operations there as well. So that's an interesting connection.
Yeah, there's an oblique, indirect reference to Ian Fleming, who was an officer at the intelligence station where the character that I codenamed O'Reilly is working. So Ian Fleming is at the same station. I don't know if their paths ever crossed, but it was this kind of oblique connection. But I think what you're interested in there is that Townsend Brown went into Germany in the closing weeks of World War II, and he was probably on a number of missions, at least one of which was to see if he could gain any insight into the aerial phenomenon that were being reported in the last months of World War II that have come to be known as the Foo Fighters. Now, most people nowadays, when they hear the expression Foo Fighters, what do they think of?
The band.
The band. Well, ask Dave Grohl. The band is named for the aerial phenomenon that were observed after World War II in the skies over Germany.
Right. And
there's a more direct connection for you. I can make a direct connection between Townsend Brown and David Grohl. I wish he'd call me.
And do you think Townsend Brown was also a spy? Did he spy for the Allies?
I don't think that he was a spy for the Allies in the direct sense that he was behind the scenes sending reports on enemy movements, or the kinds of things that you'd ordinarily associate with spy work on the ground. But I do think that he was part of the upper level spy networks that were working on things like encryption codes. And part of his mission when he went to Germany involved recovering some of the devices, the advanced devices that the Germans were using to decipher, to encode and decipher their own messages within their troops, because they didn't want that technology to fall into the hands of the Russians. So there was a big scramble in Germany in the closing months and in the months right after VE Day in May of 1945, where all these forces and squadrons are scrambling around Germany, trying to recover as much of this equipment as they could to keep it out of the hands of what they expected would be the next opposition, the next adversary in the wars to come. So
Right.
I do believe that he was involved in espionage work, but I wouldn't say that he was a conventional spy who's like looking around the corner and then reporting troop movements or something like that.
Right. And you, of course, refer to this, what they call tech plunder, which happened at the end of World War II. And I remember I really enjoyed reading this picturization where all parties interested, like whether it's the Allies, whether it's the Soviets, the Americans, the British, even people like a team from South Africa and mercenary renegade groups, everybody, it was like a free for all, and everybody wanted their hands on secret German Nazi technology by then, right?
Yeah, the word that you can use to describe Germany in at least the months of 1945, after the outcome of the war is pretty clear and it's just a matter of getting there, Germany was a state of anarchy. And there were all kinds of clandestine forces scrambling all over the German countryside, particularly in the month or two around. It's interesting because during the change of administration when Roosevelt died, and then things are changing in America as well, there were all kinds of scrambles for power and control.
Right. And speaking of Foo Fighters, of course, Brown himself had a very enduring interest in UFOs, and
That's right.
I don't know. I don't know whether he himself had any like direct experiences with UFOs, but do you think that kind of really influenced his research into electrogravitics and his obsession with pursuing anti-gravity?
I think the relationship there is that he was curious about what was being observed in the skies that was unexplained, thinking and hoping that he could learn more about the technology that he had discovered by learning more about what was being observed. And so he did, in fact, in 1956 or so, he formed one of the very first citizen UFO research groups, and that's NICAP. And you might be interested to read, I will commend to you a book by an author named Laura Powell, and the book is called Against the Odds. It's the biography of a man named Donald Kehoe, who was instrumental in the formation and operation of NICAP. But Townsend Brown was there at the inception of NICAP. If you're familiar with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, NICAP was an early iteration of MUFON. It was one of the very first networks of individual citizens trying to gather knowledge from their experience and sightings and make sense of it all. And I think Brown's interest stemmed from two sources. One was that he was genuinely interested to see if there was anything he could learn about how possible extraterrestrial technologies might work. And he also gained, in a sideways kind of way, from being associated with this fringe element in the course of trying to keep a mystique or a discrediting of his own involvement in these things.
And of course, his involvement with NICAP was very short-lived. I believe that after just a year or under a year, he was removed.
That's about right. Yeah. And it's another one of those stories where his separation from NICAP is cast in a rather dim light, which further serves to discredit his reputation.
Right. And who was the the Caroline group, because this is this enigmatic entity that keeps coming up throughout the book and throughout his life, I guess, who
Yeah.
I guess funded him and gave him missions and so on. Do we know more about the Caroline group?
Well, this is where you have to like suspend another dimension of disbelief and accept the possibility that there are, in fact, networks of vested interests that work both within and without the organizations of the military, industrial, and intelligence complexes. And so I knew early on that Brown had spent several months on an expedition in the Caribbean in 1933 aboard a yacht called the Caroline. And there's a very interesting connection there, because the Caroline was owned by a man that I had not heard of named Eldridge Reeves Johnson. And please note that the name Eldridge is the name that's given to the destroyer escort that supposedly disappeared in the Philadelphia experiment.
Yeah.
But Johnson was one of the progenitors of the recording industry, and I worked in the recording industry for a while when I first came to Nashville, so it was fascinating to me to learn about Eldridge Johnson. But we'll set that aside for the moment. So Brown traveled, he sailed on Johnson's yacht called the Caroline, named for Johnson's deceased mother, on this marine research expedition in 1933. They were dredging flora and fauna from the bottom of the ocean and trying to learn about the bottom of the ocean in the Caribbean area. But in my earliest correspondence with the source that I codenamed Morgan, he refers to an intelligence network of which Eldridge Reeves Johnson and his colleagues were part of, based on two things. First of all, that the military intelligence networks became fallow in the period between World War I and World War II. The intelligence network built up like the naval intelligence and so forth, they were not as aggressively maintained during the 1920s and early 1930s. As one Secretary of State said, gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail. And so those intelligence networks were allowed to fall by the wayside, but private business interests formed their own intelligence networks. And that is what I first understood the Caroline group to be. So in his earliest message to me, Morgan refers to the Caroline group. And so it is this reference to a network of probably mostly business, but you can't really get into business without having some kind of governmental interest as well, and that would infer a military interest. So some of those responsibilities were taken over by some of these private interests to maintain their standing in world commerce. And Brown was recruited one way or another into that network while he was on that voyage in the Caribbean with Eldridge Reeves Johnson on the yacht Caroline in 1933. And then, as you say, that became kind of the underpinning, the very secret underpinning of much of the rest of his life. And became the group that Morgan was recruited to when Morgan comes along in the early 60s.
Do you think, now we know for a fact that Townsend Brown came from a really well-off family, and his grandfather and his dad were definitely rich. Do you think the fact that he started sort of in an affluent background sort of gave him connection to these people at the higher levels of society, these businessmen and the rich people who could invite him to a yacht and things like that?
It did to some extent. Yeah, I certainly think it did to some extent, because early on in the story, when he's trying to find material support for the ideas that he's developed, he's introduced to people like the founders of General Motors and other people of high industrial standing, although mostly in the Ohio area. So he had some exposure to that. So I don't think you can discount that he was, in fact, able to avail himself to the kinds of connections that the rest of us don't really have at our disposal. Yeah, I do think so. And then
Right.
certainly once he becomes part of what we're calling the Caroline group, then he became probably deeply enmeshed in that network. And it's probably important to note also that one of the other principles, one of the international factors in what we're calling the Caroline group, was a man named William S. Stevenson. And I give him a little bit of coverage in the book as well. If you've ever heard, there's an expression from World War II, a man called intrepid. And I
I think I've
referenced
come
that in
across
the
that.
book. So if you hadn't heard it before, you heard it then. Intrepid was the code name that Winston Churchill gave to a man named William S. Stevenson, who organized the intelligence networks that was absolutely instrumental in the Allies winning World War II. And Stevenson appears a couple of times in the Townsend Brown story during the time when he is recruiting Morgan to join that network.
And kind of slowly easing off from this work into some of the more bizarre nature of this research. There are a few occasions where you speak of dreams where flying saucers land, and then sort of shared dreams between Townsend Brown and his daughter,
Yeah.
and something about reference to a set. I'm like,
Because,
what is?
okay, so when you mention the set, now we're off into an entirely different realm of the subject matter that we're discussing. Because along with what we're calling the synthetic or artificial gravitational effects of the Biefeld-Brown effect, Brown was also very keen on developing a communications aspect to that technology. And in the book, I talk about the difference between an analog radio wave, where it takes time for the signal to get from one place to another, and a gravitational wave, where you're essentially tugging on the fabric of space and the signal gets there instantly. Because it's like you're tugging on a rope. Rather than waving the rope, you're tugging on the rope, and the other end of the rope responds instantly. So that's kind of the theory behind what he was developing in the way of a communications network. And one of the things that he demonstrated at Pearl Harbor in 1950 was this application of a communications device based on this gravitational approach, or space-time continuum. And that technology was immediately taken into some kind of hiding after the demonstration at Pearl Harbor, when that demonstration was compromised, as we talked about earlier. And it was described to me as something that resembled a radio set. And in the book, we talk about how the structure of space applies itself to this possibility and the kind of antenna that it would use. So again, it's an electromagnetic kind of phenomenon that produces this gravitational effect. And the story that you're alluding, so the set was taken away and not available. And the story you're alluding to is a story that Linda, who was about 9 years old at the time, and they're living in outside of Leesburg, Virginia. And Linda tells a story to a friend who's visiting about a strange dream that she had the night before, where 3 saucer-type craft descended in a field behind the farm that they were staying at. And she has a conversation with the personnel that come off the craft, and they bring with them some manifestation of this technology that we're calling the set. Because after this occasion, whether it was a dream or not, now Townsend Brown always has at his disposal and never goes anywhere without something that looks like a shortwave radio. It may have been just a shortwave radio, but he's never very far without it. And the story is that the following evening, Linda and her friend Chip are having dinner with Townsend and Josephine and Chip's parents at the farm in outside of Leesburg. And Townsend starts telling the story of the dream that he had the night before, and it's the same dream that Linda had had. And when I started talking about all of this with Morgan, all Morgan would say was, it was not a dream.
Wow. Wow. It just gets more and more, I know what you mean by the rabbit hole right now,
Yeah.
It's just like it's difficult to say where, I mean, where like solid physics ends and where all this sort of fluid, strange concepts begin, and where like how they overlap with real life,
Well, I'll be a little philosophical with you here because we've been talking for a while. I was greatly influenced in ways that I'm still learning by seeing the movie Oppenheimer last summer. Now, have you seen the movie?
Not yet. It's on my list.
Well, it's very interesting because, first of all, it demonstrates that it is possible to have a big project going on and nobody really knowing about it or knowing what's going on. But the thing that struck me about Oppenheimer was it makes it more possible to suspend a lot of the disbelief that I come to a storyline like this about. I think I said at the start, it is difficult for my rational leaning mind to accept the idea that all this stuff could be going on behind a curtain somewhere, where even when you peel the curtain back, it's still black and you can't see anything. And then I think, well, they did manage to conceal the Manhattan Project from the public for a long time. Now, that isn't to say that other sources, other people didn't know what was going on, but it was kept from the public for a very long time. So that makes it a little easier for me to entertain the possibility, or as I said earlier, suspend the disbelief that it's possible for all this stuff to be some kind of real. That there may have been an occasion in 1956 where 3 craft came from somewhere and descended in Townsend Brown's backyard and brought him a piece of equipment that he used to communicate with forces unknown to us. Yes, wow. It requires a certain level of what they call the suspension of disbelief.
Right.
How much disbelief do you want to suspend to continue this conversation?
When you mention this instantaneous communication, what I'm reminded of is this concept called spooky action at a distance, or non-locality.
Exactly.
Non-locality.
That's quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement is there is an accepted scientific theory that is absolutely analogous to what I'm describing as Townsend Brown's communication device.
Right. I remember watching this really fascinating TEDx talk by Russell Targ, where he was talking about non-locality and how, like, on the face of it, it seems impossible because information cannot travel faster than the speed of light. And yet it's possible for almost near instantaneous communication to happen. It's almost like it's sort of blipping out of one dimension and blipping back in another location. And right. So there's definitely something seriously wrong with our model of reality. It's completely inadequate, which is why all these things appear miraculous. And I think once you expand your model of reality, everything will just make sense, I guess.
I want to share with you a quote that I just picked up from a most unexpected source. So there's a movie in America right now called Poor Things, which is one of the movies that's in contention for the Best Picture Oscar next month. And it's the quotation is totally unrelated to the story, but it's perfectly pertinent to what we're talking about. And so that's when the lead character, played by Emma Stone, says, and I've almost got this memorized now, she says, well, that's the way it is until we discover the new way that it is. And that's the way it is until we discover the new way that it is. And so it goes until the earth is no longer flat and electricity lights the night and we no longer tie our shoes with ribbons. And that's exactly what you're saying. Everything gets so baked in because we reach a certain level of knowledge and understanding, and on some level we have to be able to accept that that's just the way it is. And then somebody comes along like Albert Einstein in 1905 and says, no, that's not the way it is. And then suddenly we're off on a whole new way that it is while we're waiting for the discovery of the next new way that it is.
Do you think we are on the threshold of something like that again?
That's what I'm wondering now, because there seems to be so much activity percolating in this realm, where we're having disclosure and conversations and congressional hearings, and we're talking about, well, are these things that are appearing in our skies, are they from someplace else in the galaxy? Are they something that have been developed secretly here on Earth? Are they visiting us from another time? That is all becoming part of the conversation now in a way that I think that it has not been in the past, fostered, I would say, because of the McLuhanist in me, partly because of the internet. Because now we have all these ways to discuss these unorthodox and out of the mainstream theories. They're getting much more traction than they ever did before. So maybe we are on the threshold of discovering the new way that it is. I'd like to think so.
I do have one quick point to sort of squeeze in before we start winding down. This fan that he seems to be constantly working on, this fan without moving parts.
Right.
Now, was that so when I looked up fan without moving parts, I come up with something called the Dyson fan, which seems to be coming from a completely different person. So what happened to this fan that Townsend Brown was working on? Was it ever commercialized into a product, or was it a cover for something else? Because at some point you do refer to the fan as it's actually a propulsion device.
Do I refer to the fan as a propulsion device? I guess I do. The direct answer to your question is that when I started the conversation with the reference to the ionic breeze air purifier, that's the fan.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if it does have a propulsion effect, then that's going to be based on ionic wind, because that's the fluid dielectric model. But the answer to your question, what became of the fan?
Right.
The fan, I think, was part of the subterfuge. It was used to demonstrate the Biefeld-Brown effect to military industrial interests in the mid to late 1960s. And the story is that the military application of that technology is demonstrated in the wings of the B-2 bomber. That the B-2 bomber generates a negative electrical field behind it, and a positive electrical field in front of it. And at high altitudes where the air is thin, it applies additional lift by surfing that electrostatic wave. So there are two applications of what was demonstrated as the fan, and that's the ionic breeze air purifier, which was developed for commercial use by somebody that Brown worked with on Catalina Island in, I guess, the 70s or early 80s. And the military effect was taken undercover by the Rand Corporation, handed over to Grumman Northrop, and developed under their aegis.
Shifting the focus away from Townsend Brown as we sort of wind down, what is your background? Because to research somebody like Townsend Brown and all these concepts, like, do you have like an engineering degree, or like, do you have, I mean, you need to have some kind of familiarity with physics or science, right?
I am what you would call an autodidact.
Okay.
I am self-taught. I have learned enough of these rarefied concepts to be fairly good at reducing them to lay terms that an average reader can understand. Nobody is ever going to confuse me with being a nuclear physicist, or as I like to say, I'm not a quantum scientist, but I play one on the internet.
Right.
But I'll just share with you on a personal note, because I was telling this story to somebody else the other night. Regardless of the credentials, the genesis of this for me goes back to when I was in the third grade. And my mother took me to a library in Rumson, New Jersey, and said, pick a book. She was concerned I wasn't reading enough, so she took me to the library and forced me to buy a book. And where is it? Here, I'll show it to you, because I got a copy of it. I picked up the signature edition of The Story of Thomas Alva Edison. So I've been into inventor stories since the third grade.
So this was destined.
And I have studied enough science to be conversant, if not credentially expert.
Just to play a little devil's advocate here, would you know, or would you suspect, if you were being played Like, for example, this character Morgan, who maybe the information that he was feeding in, maybe there is some information that they want to come into, it wants to come into the mainstream. Maybe there's disinformation at some level. Can that also, is that possible?
Do you want my honest answer to that question?
Yes.
I absolutely think it's possible I've been played. I cannot discount any possibility in the course of telling these stories. And I don't want to be one of these people that presents an absurd hypothesis and then insists that it has to be true. I do have the ability to be somewhat objective about the things that I'm saying and understand where they skate up against the limits of known information, known knowledge, and be able to say, well, it's possible that somebody's handing me a line there. So right. I came into this to tell a story, and I got material that lent itself to the creation of some kind of narrative. Now, is the narrative that I then created part of some larger, still unknown narrative? I do not discount the possibility.
Are you still in touch with some of these people? Like, is Morgan still writing to you, or?
I have been in touch with Linda. She and I were estranged for a long time after I abandoned the project in 2009. She and I met for the first time in 13 years last fall. So I will say for the record that Linda and I are in communication again, though it's very sporadic, but I don't want to say any more about any of the other contacts than that.
Got it. And you mentioned that Townsend Brown wrote this book called The Structure of Space, book or an article. I don't really recall.
Yeah, it was a white paper.
Is that in the public domain, or are you planning to publish it?
It is essentially in the public domain. It was. I found a digital copy of it where somebody put it on the. I was planning to make it available, but I discovered that it was already available, and I don't have the link off the top of my head, but I have placed a PDF version of that document on my website. And if you go to the website ttbrown.com and just do a search from the top of the website for structure of space, or even just the word structure, the article with that link will come up.
Okay, and as we close this conversation, what are you currently working on? Are you doing further research, coming up with another book on the subject, or doing something else? What are your?
I'm doing something else. I don't think I have another obscure 20th century inventor story in me. So, I mean, I started on the Farnsworth. I met the Farnsworth family in 1975, and I didn't publish a book about Philo Farnsworth until 2002. Then I started on the Townsend Brown book, and I didn't publish that from 2003 until 2023. And I'm now 73 years old, so do the math. But I am starting to work on a book that I think both of these books, in their own way, has been steering me toward, even though the subject material on the surface would seem to be completely different. And I think that I will keep that one kind of close to the vest for now, but I have started working on another project, and I think I have enough time left to finish it.
Hey, maybe there's a Netflix movie in there on the enigmatic scientist's life. Sounds like a perfect Netflix movie recipe, you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't want to spend too much. Somebody criticized me on a review on Amazon for saying too much in the Townsend Brown book about the Philo Farnsworth book. But one wouldn't exist without the other.
Right.
And I would say to your comment about some kind of movie for television, Netflix or something, it still astounds me that more than 50 years after I got involved in the Philo Farnsworth story, that nobody has really done a movie for television about the boy who invented it. And it is one of the great stories of the 20th century. And,
right.
And so I'll come back to what we were talking about earlier. Is there something yet to be discovered that becomes the new thing, the new way that it is until the next new thing is discovered? Is there something embodied in both of these stories together that expresses some knowledge that mankind is not yet ready for? And I get a sense of that in the tail end of the Philo Farnsworth story, where he was working on a nuclear fusion device. And I don't want to go too deeply into that because we'll spend another 90 minutes and I'll tell you all about Philo Farnsworth.
Well, Paul Schatzkin, thank you so much for this really entertaining and information-filled talk. Really enjoyed having a chat on this subject.
And I appreciate the interest from the other side of the world. I really do.
Thanks. Thank you so much.